Three, two, one.
Welcome to our channel, Sloom Room. Today, I'm going to tell you about one of the most unsettling stories on the entire internet. A case so real, it left deep marks on horror culture worldwide. But before we start, let me ask you something. Have you ever stopped to think what you'd do if reality suddenly started behaving in a completely inexplicable way? And what if it didn't happen to a stranger, but to someone close to you? Well, that's exactly what you're about to find out. In 1949, in the suburb of Mount Rainier, near Washington, D.C., a case that science has never managed to explain properly began to disturb everyone who crossed paths with it. An ordinary boy, just 14 years old, started experiencing phenomena that completely defied the laws of physics and reason. But here's the detail most people don't know. This real account inspired one of the scariest movies in film history. Can you imagine what was so disturbing it scarred entire generations? Stick with me, because what comes next will change your sense of what's truly possible. The origin of the tragedy. His story began in the most innocent way. A boy like any other, raised in a regular Lutheran family of German descent. His real name was protected by the Catholic Church, but historical documents refer to him as Roland Doe or Robbie Mannheim, aliases to preserve the young man's privacy. He was an only child, close to his parents, and had a special bond with his Aunt Harriet, a spiritualist who attended seances and deeply believed in communicating with the dead. During that dark period, when World War II still haunted many families' memories, Aunt Harriet introduced Roland to something that would become crucial in this story. The Ouija board. Yes, the game you've probably seen in horror movies. At the time, for Harriet, it was simply a legitimate tool for spiritual communication, common in American spiritist circles. For Roland, it was an adventure, a mystery, a way to connect with someone he loved. They would spend hours together, fingers on the planchette, trying to receive messages from beyond. But in January 1949, everything changed forever. Harriet died suddenly, and that's when it all began. The first disturbance days after the funeral, the family started hearing strange sounds coming from the walls of Roland's bedroom. Not normal house noises, sounds that began out of nowhere and vanished just as mysteriously. Scratches, rhythmic knocks, as if something or someone were trying to communicate from inside the walls themselves. Roland's mother, Phyllis, was unnerved. His father, Carl, tried to rationalize it. Maybe rats, maybe the house settling, but Roland knew it was different. He knew it had started exactly after his aunt's death. Things escalated quickly. Objects began to move on their own. Chairs that had been in one spot turned up somewhere else. Roland's bed would shake violently, especially at night when he tried to sleep. The family consulted their Lutheran pastor, Luther Miles Schulze, a skeptic who didn't believe in demonic possession. In fact, he considered it a medieval relic left to the Catholics. But when Schulze spent a night at the house to observe for himself, his skepticism was shattered. The Reverend witnessed Roland's bed levitate while the boy slept. When he asked Roland to try sleeping in a chair, that heavy armchair slid around the room and suddenly toppled over. Schulze was in shock. He immediately recommended the family seek help from the Jesuit community. An astonishing admission coming from a Lutheran pastor who had dismissed possession as superstition. The turning point, the search for a solution. This is where the real journey began. Roland's family traveled to St. Louis, Missouri, where they reached out to St. Louis University and its Jesuit community. Father Raymond Bishop, a professor at the university, was one of the first to be informed about the case. He was immediately interested and began keeping meticulous records. But before anything else, Roland underwent a battery of scientific and psychological tests. Physicians examined him. Psychiatrists evaluated him. No one could find any rational explanation for the events. One detail that rarely gets mentioned. According to documents that surfaced later, there was no evidence of possession before the exorcisms began. It was as if the very act of trying to fix the problem triggered increasingly violent manifestations. Between February and March 1949, the situation became so serious that church authorities authorized a formal exorcism. Father William S. Bodern, a World War II veteran with vast pastoral experience, was chosen to lead the rites. What happened next was meticulously documented in Father Bishop's diaries and became the most complete account of an exorcism in Catholic records since the Middle Ages. Journalist Thomas B. Allen gained exclusive access to those diaries when a Catholic priest, Father Walter Halloran, shared the records in 1978, almost 30 years later. The result was the book Possessed, the true story of an exorcism, which served as a foundation for the novel and then the film, The Exorcist. Face to face, what was recorded for nearly 2 months between March and April 1949, the rites continued. And here's the part that really unsettles. Every detail was documented by respected religious witnesses. The diaries report that Roland thrashed violently, so violently that 3 men had to restrain his arms, legs, and head. He barked out phrases in Latin, a language he had never studied. His voice changed completely, becoming guttural and strange, nothing like an adolescent's natural voice. He spat in the priests' faces. He spat on religious images. When holy water was poured on him, his body convulsed as if hit by an electric shock. On one occasion, he scratched his own face so violently he left deep marks. On another, he literally broke one of the priest's noses. The disproportionate strength remains something that baffles experts who study the case to this day. How could a 14-year-old boy have enough power to break an adult man's nose? But the most disturbing thing came from the words. Between the rites, Roland said things about the priests' lives that he simply shouldn't have known. He revealed personal secrets, intimate facts he had never discussed with anyone. It was as if something inside him had total access to the minds of everyone around him. The priests documented these revelations, marking them in the diaries. Some details have never been made public out of respect for the victims of those violations of privacy. The turning of the tide, unexpected consequences. This is where the story gets fascinating and perplexing. After dozens of rites, estimates range from 20 to 30 exorcisms, something changed. In April 1949, the priests began to notice Roland recovering. The manifestation subsided. His voice returned to normal. His abnormal strength vanished. The family reported that the paranormal events had stopped completely. On August 20th, 1949, the Washington Post published an anonymous report confirming that a 14-year-old boy in Mount Rainier had been freed from demonic possession by Catholic priests. But here's the contradiction no expert can answer with confidence. Roland always insisted, even as an adult, that he had not been possessed. He said he was just a bad boy and that everything had been exaggerated or fabricated. He went on to live a successful life, worked for more than 40 years as an engineer at NASA, got married, had children, but he lived with an obsessive fear that his past would be discovered by his colleagues. Why would a man who was cured of possession remain fearful for the rest of his life if it had all been a simple psychological problem? The reversal and the enduring mystery. What makes this case truly disturbing isn't just what happened. It's what remains unexplained. Historians like Henry A. Kelly have questioned aspects of the account. Analysts have suggested Roland might have suffered from psychological disorders. Others argue that the family atmosphere, a superstitious, strict mother and a father who spoiled him, created conditions ripe for disturbed behavior. But the documents at the Catholic institutions in St. Louis are still there, preserved, recording every detail. Father Bishop's diaries describe phenomena that still defy conventional explanation. Father Walter Halloran, one of the primary witnesses, spent the rest of his life maintaining that he had seen something genuinely supernatural. He shared the records with Thomas B. Allen, who became obsessed with the story, consulting experts, interviewing witnesses, and building a narrative that remains deliberately ambiguous, leaving room for each reader to draw their own conclusions. The legacy that still echoes the story of Roland Doe didn't end in 1949. It went on to shape popular culture for decades. A young man named William Peter Blatty heard about the case while studying at Georgetown University, not far from where it all happened. Fascinated and disturbed, Blatty decided to turn that real experience into fiction. In 1971, he published The Exorcist, which became one of the most influential novels in history. 2 years later, in 1973, the film hit theaters and terrified audiences so deeply that people vomited, fainted, and ambulances had to be called. But here's the true power of this story. The original case is more disturbing than any fiction. The documents remain. The testimonies persist. The questions still have no definitive answer. Roland Doe, whose real identity was Ronald Hunkeler, died in 2020, taking his secrets to the grave. His partner said a priest she had never called showed up at their home shortly before his death to administer the last rites. When asked how the priest knew to come, she simply had no explanation. And that's where this account ends. I'll leave you with the same question the internet keeps asking. What really happened during those 2 months in 1949? Is there a complete scientific explanation that no one has found in over 70 years? Or are there things in this world that simply don't fit into our categories of understanding? Thanks for watching all the way through. If this story rattled you as much as it rattled me, drop a like and subscribe to the Sloom Room channel. In the next videos, we'll explore more stories that defy logic. May the truth prevail, wherever it may be. See you next time.